All right, we're rolling. Are we rolling? Good morning, everybody. Chuck Holton here, coming to you from the studio here in Panama. And today is the 3-year anniversary of the start of the war in Ukraine. And here's what I'm going to try to do today. Since, I've been heavily involved since the beginning of this war. As a matter of fact, I was in Ukraine at before the start of the war, about 3 weeks before the war started, was on the ground for I've been on the ground probably 6 or 8 trips to Ukraine total since the war began, and have spent a total of more than 6 months on the ground there. And so I'm obviously heavily invested in reporting on the conflict from Ukraine. And I know that there's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of rancor. There's a lot of anger and just people that are fed up with spending money on every country on planet Earth except our own, it seems like. I get it. There's a lot of people who are feeling like we don't have any more money. We've been putting everything on a Chinese credit card for so long that we can't afford to be spending money on anything other than our own country. I personally am giddy as I watch this new Department of Government Efficiency just tearing through the American bureaucracy with a huge sigh. I mean, a big sickle, just taking a sickle to the root and branch of our uh, federal government. This is fantastic. And so I know there are a lot of people who are highly against, let's say, funding the war in Ukraine, supporting Ukraine. A lot of people who are even so tainted, I would say, by Russian propaganda that they actually believe Ukraine is the bad guy here. But I'm not going to argue with you. I'm going to try not to argue with you about that today. What I'm going to try to do today on the 3-year anniversary of the war is just to tell you the stories that I have seen personally on the ground over the last 3 years. I'm going to just explain to you what it was like at the beginning of the war, being there as millions of people fled their homes, watching people be gunned down by Russian snipers, seeing people have their homes destroyed by random shelling and rocket fire. I'm just going to tell you the stories of the people on the ground because that is, to me, what's really important. The politics, I could really care less. When I go into war zones, the thing that I care about most is the innocent civilians who are being affected by this conflict. And so I'm going to tell you their stories today. And when I'm done, we have a kind of a video that has collected up some of the experiences that I had in Ukraine in the last 3 years. And we made just a little short, kind of a 10-minute mini documentary about the war, give you kind of a backgrounder, because I think a lot of people have forgotten about the people. They've forgotten about what has actually happened on the ground. They've forgotten about the hundreds and hundreds of babies, little children, that have been murdered by Russian shelling, by indiscriminate killing from Russia. And I'm not going to even pretend that I'm going to be unbiased about this. I'm If you see evil in in the flesh, if you see evil being done, and you try to say, well, I'm not going to call it evil because I want to be unbiased, I just think that's cowardly. I think that when we see evil, we should call it evil. And I am going to call it evil because it is. Now, are the Ukrainians lily white, pure as the driven snow? No, of course not. And they've done things that I have called out as evil during this war. The difference is I could actually be in Ukraine and criticize Ukraine, criticize things that were done by Ukrainian troops, for example, and they wouldn't make me disappear. They wouldn't kick me out of the country. They actually let me do my reporting and call on the Ukrainian government to prosecute war criminals within their midst, and they did. They arrested the people who were responsible and they prosecuted them. So look, you're going to always, if you watch this channel, you're always going to get my unvarnished opinion about what's going on. And I will promise you, not warn you, I'll promise you that my unvarnished opinion comes from my experience on the ground. And I believe that being there where the thing is happening, whatever the thing happens to be, gives me a, well, let's just say a unique perspective, gives me a perspective that you might be interested in, even if it doesn't square with your stated political tribe, the positions held by the left or the right or whatever. I'm just going to tell you what I saw, and you can make up your own mind. So, without further ado, let's go back to the 1st of February. I got to Ukraine on the 7th of February, 2022. I was sent there by Newsmax. They called and said, hey, we think there's going to be a war. And I said, well, all the experts are saying that Russia's just bluffing. They're not going to do it. Newsmax said, no, we think that there's actually going to be a war. And I said, okay. They said, we need we're sending one of our reporters over there, and we need someone to be security for her. So could you go and do security for her? If you don't know, I have a side gig. I'm not just a war correspondent. I have a couple of other things going in my life. One of them is I have a security and logistics company that provides logistics and travel planning and security for very high net worth individuals, companies, even governments. We've had contracts with everyone from the U.S. State Department to the Gates family to uh, Amazon.com. And we do these contracts just several times a year, just kind of catch as catch can. So they actually contacted me to see if I would go and provide security for Sarah Williamson, who's their one of their international correspondents. And I said, well, okay, sure. So I went over there. It was supposed to be a 3-week deal. Well, we were there. We went down to the what they call the occupied zone, the parts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts that were taken over by Russia in 2014. And they had front lines down there. They had been fighting down there ever since 2014. Actually, the war, the Ukrainians will tell you the war started in 2008. I'm going to pin your question there, Edward, and I'll get to it in a minute. So we went down and we traveled the entirety of the red line between occupied Ukrainian territory and the rest of Ukraine. Now, at that time, Russian propaganda was saying that Russian propaganda was saying that Ukraine was bombing the occupied areas of their own country. They were shelling, according to Russia, Luhansk City, Donetsk City, the airport in Luhansk, and I was right across the line from the airport when they said that was happening. Our intrepid pro-Russian correspondent that many people have seen, Patrick Lancaster, was reporting from Luhansk airport saying the Ukrainians have been shelling the airport all day. And he was showing people lying around in the streets as if they were dead. The only crazy thing was none of the buildings had any damage to them. There were glass windows that were still intact and everything. So kind of strange shelling if they don't break anything except kill a bunch of people. But I was about 1 mile away from him when he was doing his reporting that the Ukrainians were shelling that, and there was no shelling happening. Nothing. There was nothing happening. It was pure propaganda. And so I am pretty sure that, I mean, from what I saw in the days leading up to the invasion, on the Red Line, talking to the people who lived there, Russian-speaking individuals who have family in Russia, whose families were forcibly relocated to that region after the 1933 Holodomor, the famine that was caused by the Soviets, that killed off over 1 million people in Ukraine. Those people were telling me Russia has been attacking us for years. We don't think they're going to invade because they were just so used to Russia attacking. They weren't taking any extra precautions. They weren't preparing. They weren't saving up food or anything. They were just kind of going about their business. And they're like, yeah, Russia's always threatening, blah, 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 whatever. And they didn't really think it was going to happen. It was really strange to watch them just doing their thing, even while you could hear shelling from Russia coming in. We went and visited sites like a school that was hit by a mortar that was fired from the occupied territory into just across the Red Line. And the people that lived there were like, yep, that happens. They shell us all the time. Everybody had stories like that. Meanwhile, 14,000 people had been killed since 2008 until 2022. That's right, Frank. In Ukraine, on the Ukrainian side, Ukrainians had been killed. So this was what we saw. We traveled to Mariupol. We traveled to Kherson. We went to a training exercise that was put on by the Ukrainian military, preparing for what to do in case of an invasion. And it had less to do with marshaling their troops to fight back against an invasion and more about rescuing people out of like burned out buildings, bombed out buildings, things like that. While we were at that training exercise, there was a commotion off to my left, and I looked over, and there was President Zelensky surrounded by his people, like 20 feet from me. And so everything, when it was over, he stood there and took questions from the assembled press. My friend Trey Yinks from Fox News was next to me and asked him point blank, Why are you acting so nonchalant about the possibility of an invasion? When the Russians are marshaling hundreds of thousands of troops across the line, and we need to, I mean, why aren't you telling people to flee or get prepared or whatever? And Zelensky said, look, it's my job as the leader of this country to make sure that there is not panic in the streets. If I said that, Russia was about to invade, there would be panic. So we're preparing, and we're hoping that Russia will not invade. But they were prepared, obviously. So then we got on a train on the 20th of February, and we took the train overnight back to Ukraine, back to Kyiv, put ourselves up in the Hilton Hotel, and went out and talked to the people. Again, people going about their business, did not believe that they would actually invade. And then on the morning of the 22nd, about 4 o'clock in the morning, we got woken up by air raid sirens, and the invasion was on. At that point, hundreds of thousands of people tried to flee all at once. And there was massive, just chaos in the streets of Kyiv. Many of the experts said that Russia would be rolling through the streets of Kyiv with tanks in less than 48 hours. They had invaded from the north, coming down through the Chernobyl dead zone, and they had invaded from the east. And so they could have gone. I mean, what the thought was that they would very quickly take Kyiv, and the thing would be over. They would take over Ukraine that way by unseating the government. For its part, the United States government contacted Vladimir Zelensky and said, hey, it's probably about time that you beat feet for the door and head out. So we will send a Black Hawk helicopter to pick you up and fly you into exile in Europe. And Vladimir Zelensky said, I don't need a ride. I need bullets. And he put on a military uniform and a flak vest and a helmet, and he picked up a weapon, and he and his advisors, his vice president, and the mayor of Kyiv, the former heavyweight boxing champion, they all went out and took up fighting positions around the city and prepared to defend the city with their lives. Now, I don't know about you, but at that time we had a Roomba for a president, Joe Biden, who thought that you could affect foreign policy by getting on TV and giving Russia a stern don't. Don't. And of course, we all know how that turned out. And I don't believe that the war would have likely started at all if Donald Trump had been our president at that time, but the world will never know now. The war did start. And so the Russians pushed in to Kyiv. We had a rental car. I had stocked up with extra fuel. I had very precisely tried to calculate our range, the total distance we could go with our rental car, because we had a team of 4 people, cameraman, audio guy, myself as security, and uh, we had the Newsmax correspondent, Sarah Williamson. And so we were ready at any moment to get out of Kyiv. I had made exfil plans and backup exfil plans for which direction to go, which roads to take. I predicted correctly that the highways would be blocked just by traffic, by people trying to get out. So I had previously mapped out dirt roads, farm fields, stuff that we could get across to get out of town, and we had practiced that even getting out of Kyiv to the south. We saw people, there were just masses of people trying to get out of town as this was happening. But we stayed in Kyiv for the first couple of days. And the Russians pushed closer and closer. We got to the point where we could hear the fighting off in the distance, and then we could see the fighting off in the distance from the hilltops in downtown Kyiv that overlook to the east and the north, overlook the Dnieper River. We, like I said, we're kind of expecting that at any moment we're going to have to make a break for it and get out of there. I had so many friends and colleagues who were texting me saying, "Get out now, get out now. You've got to, you're going to be caught." And if we got caught by the Russians, could have been a bad day for us. But we were being cautious, if not careful. We were being intentional about what we were doing. And so we stayed and continued to report on what was going on. There was only one hotel that was open at that point. It was the Premier Palace Hotel. Well, it was more than one, but that was the one we stayed in. And there were a bunch of the whole hotel was full of journalists, and all the restaurants were closed, all the gas stations were closed. So we were holed up in the hotel. We had to eat at the hotel. They did a great job of taking care of us. We still had filet mignon and salmon, and I mean, it was crazy. There was a curfew at 8 p.m. every night, and if you were out after curfew, they shot first and asked questions later, so you didn't want to be out after curfew. I would stand on the street corner doing a live broadcast with Sarah, and there would be CNN on the other street corner, Fox over here on this street corner, all the journalists kind of lined up out there. And I would listen to the other journalists, and here's the figure of speech I heard over and over and over again. It was, we're hearing very loud explosions coming from the north, and that means that the Russians are pushing into the city and will soon be taking over Kyiv. Well, if ever you hear a journalist say very loud explosions, you can kind of stop listening, because that is them telling you they don't know what they're talking about. Because have you ever heard a quiet explosion? I think many of them probably had never heard any explosion. And so all the explosions sounded loud to them. I think what they were trying to say is that we could hear explosions. That's my pet peeve. We're hearing loud explosions. Oh, really? I'm hearing quiet ones off in the distance. And I told them as much. I said, look, those explosions are 20 miles away. And they said, no, that's not possible. You can't hear explosions 20 miles away. And I was like, oh, yes, you can, if they're very loud explosions. And when I was listening to those explosions, what I was hearing with the experience of 20 years as a war correspondent was telling me we didn't need to be concerned, because I was hearing outgoing fire, not incoming fire. You see, incoming fire, when you're on the receiving end of artillery especially, and bombs, it kind of makes a double explosion sound, like a ka-wump, ka-wump, right? And it's a very deep sound that you feel in your chest. When it's outgoing explosions, what you hear is pa, just like a crack. And that's what we were hearing, was outgoing explosions. But most journalists have not been around enough explosions to know the difference between incoming and outgoing fire. So that was outgoing fire. So if what we were hearing was outgoing, what we were hearing was the Ukrainians fighting back, not the Russians taking over. And that told me the Ukrainians were holding the Russians off. Well, that was the exact opposite of what CNN was reporting. They were saying, we're hearing the Russians pushing into the city. Well, that wasn't true. The Russians were still well outside city limits. And we found out later, a couple days later, because we went to Irpin in the northwest corner of Kyiv, And Irpin and Bucha were the closest that the Russians got, just outside the city limits of Kyiv. There was a bridge out there that separated Irpin from Kyiv proper. The Ukrainians blew the bridge up because they wanted to make it harder for the Russians to get into Kyiv. And so we went out there to see that bridge. And the first thing I noticed when we walked up on the bridge was that there was a body laying on the ground on top of the bridge just before the part where it had been blown up. And it turned out that it was a guy who had been shot by a Russian sniper as he was pedaling his bicycle trying to get into back to Kyiv. So that's how close the Russians were at that time. And there were people milling around, and I was like, hey, Sarah, we should probably go over here and get down in the ditch and walk in the ditch instead of walking in the middle of the road right here, because that guy over there got killed by a sniper. So we don't want to be the next one. So then we went down, and what we noticed was that there were thousands of people trying to flee across the river that the bridge had spanned. But since the bridge was no longer there, they had wooden planks across, kind of laid across the rubble. And people were balancing, trying to get across these wooden planks and get across there. As we got down to the river level, we realized that there were people that were fleeing who were injured. As it turned out, there was a hospital that was being evacuated that was in Bucha, and they were getting to the river's edge, and then those little planks were, you couldn't bring a wheelchair across. They were too narrow, too rickety. And there were people that were on crutches that, were all bandaged up and things like that from the shelling that the Russians did on the civilian population before they took Bucha. There were drones up in the sky that were filming what the Russians were doing as they pushed into Bucha, and they were just wholesale massacring people in the streets, machine gunning civilians as they were trying to get away. There was later on footage that came out of the Russians rounding up men and binding them together and then taking them off and lining them up and executing them. When the whole truth came out about the atrocities that took place in Bucha and Irpin, they are beyond what I can describe to you on this platform, or I would get kicked off. Little girls as young as 4 violated by multiple Russian soldiers. Uh, horrific stuff that took place. We interviewed the people who were there, who were fleeing at that time, coming out, telling us what they were seeing in there. It was absolutely brutal. And I saw I think it was an AP journalist who was carrying a guy on his back. And he got to the edge of the water and he couldn't go any further. I don't know how far he had carried him, but he was gassed out. And so I ran over to him and said, "Here, let me take that guy." And he put the guy down. It turned out it was a older man who was missing one leg, and his other leg was broken. So he couldn't even stand. He was in great pain, obviously. So I picked him up and put him over my shoulder and in a fireman's carry, and then carried him across the river on those planks and up the hill there were some ambulances that were waiting, kind of out of the range of the sniper fire. I took him over to the ambulance and laid him down, and he just cried and hugged me and whatever. Then there was another journalist there that got some footage of that moment, later sent it to me, and it kind of went viral. And they made a much bigger deal out of that than they needed to. trying to proclaim, "Oh, Chuck Holton's a hero, a hero." I said, "Well, I don't know about a hero, but I wouldn't be a man if I would just watch somebody die when there's something I could do to save their lives." I even had some people claim that, well, Chuck Holton is foregoing his journalistic ethics by getting involved in the situation. He should stay neutral. Yeah, well, if you would stand there and watch somebody die when you could do something to save their life in the name of journalistic ethics, then I would say screw your journalistic ethics. I don't want to have anything to do with ethics like that. Ken Cooper says Zelensky doesn't know where half the 300 billion went. That's because it wasn't 300 billion. 300 billion figure, it was 350 billion that President Trump quoted, was just a lie. It's just not true. The United States has not, in any way, shape, or form, spent 300 billion on this war. Nowhere close. And I've gone over the numbers so many times. That's not what I want to talk about here today. But it'd be easy for Zelensky to say, I don't know where 300 billion went, because they haven't received 300 billion. They've received less than 100 billion from the United States in terms of military hardware, about 120 billion if you include humanitarian aid. Total in 3 years. And that is easily verifiable numbers. That's not a matter of opinion. Now, once we left Irpin, it turned out it was the high watermark of Russia's advance into Kyiv. They also had an air assault on the Hostomel airport, which is kind of southwest of Kyiv, kind of almost due south of Kyiv. And the Russians took over that airport. They had the largest cargo aircraft on planet Earth that was parked there. It was a Ilyushin, I forget the name of it, or the nomenclature, but it was massive, massive airplane that belonged to Ukraine, the biggest cargo aircraft in the world. And of course, even though it was sitting there and it wasn't hurting anybody, the Russians blew it up just for fun. The crazy thing was the highway by which many Ukrainians were fleeing out of Kyiv went right by that airport. And the Russians never took close enough control of the area to block that road. And so I drove by the airport within sight of it several times, getting in and out of the city, which is really weird because I personally was a part of a jump clearing team when I was in the Rangers a long time ago. And when we took over an airport, one of the first things you do is you send out blocking positions and you block the roads around the airport to give your guys on the airport more time to react if there's a quick reaction force that comes. But they didn't do that. And they were eventually pushed out of the airport, and it was retaken by the Ukrainians. We eventually moved out of Kyiv for a couple of days and went down to some cabins by the side of the road, just outside of just a real remote area, and did our reporting from down there for a few days because they were very concerned there was going to be like massive World War II style aerial bombardment of Kyiv. Turned out that didn't happen. Russia was never able to get or maintain control of the skies at all. And that was mostly not because of the very small Ukrainian Air Force, which quickly was decimated by Russia, but because of the massive number of thousands of Javelin and other missiles, man pads, we call them, man portable aerial defense systems, that were given to Ukraine before the war started. And they were able to shoot down anything that flew. So because Russia couldn't get control of the skies, they couldn't get or maintain air superiority, They lost the initiative in their pushes into Kyiv. They were also hampered by very bad maintenance on their vehicles. There were apparently some maintenance contracts that had gone out that had been, money had been pocketed by the generals rather than put to good use maintaining their vehicles, and that came back to bite them in the butt when they went to war. So a lot of their tires were dry rotted, for example, from being in storage for so long, and so they fell apart once they got on the road. The Russians who were in the coming down from the north in the exclusionary zone around Chernobyl, they were never taught about the terrors of Chernobyl, about what happened there, at least not taught enough about it. So they just did what infantrymen do, and they dug foxholes in the ground and promptly gave themselves radiation poisoning. They said there were at least 8 busloads of Russian soldiers who were taken back to Russia with acute radiation sickness and later died. That's a terrible way to go. Oof. So we stayed in Kyiv and continued to report on the war. When the Russians started pulling back, we went into Bucha, went into Irpin. We went out to the places where the Russians had been to see the damage. When missiles would come into Kyiv, at first people would go hide in the subways or bomb shelters, and later on they just kind of said, "Ah, heck with it," because Kyiv is a city of 4 million people, and Russia was able to get 1 or 2 missiles or drones in every day. So it's like if you're in a town the size of Washington, D.C., and you know that 1 building or 2 buildings are going to go up in flames today, what are the chances it's going to be your building, right? That was the thought that people in Ukraine had. So they just kind of went back to their lives, the few people that were left. But actually, Kyiv itself ended up having more people in it after the war started than it did when it began, because even though millions of people fled, other people came from the eastern parts of Ukraine and came to Kyiv. So they refilled it. Eventually, after a few weeks, restaurants started opening back up, the stores started opening back up, and life went on in the city. We then started traveling around. I went down to Mykolaiv and Odessa and went out to the front lines. I got to know one of the president's right-hand men, is kind of his paladin, his advisors, a guy named Andrei Gota. And Andrei would call me and say, "Hey, there's a shipment of U.S. weapons or vehicles or whatever, artillery, that's coming in through Poland." Of course, Russian propaganda is pushing this narrative that that all that weaponry and stuff is getting sold out the back door. Would you like to come and follow it and come ride along with the equipment and see that it gets to the front lines? I said yes. So I would go out and ride along and track that stuff out to the front lines. And it did. It all got where it was going. Most of the stuff that was being brought in, and even to this day, most of the stuff that's being brought in is very large equipment and heavy ammunition. The claim that that's going to Mexico to fund the cartels is laughable on its face, because what are the cartels going to do with 155 millimeter artillery shells? What are they going to do with Patriot missile batteries? It's the size of a semi truck. It'd be fairly easy to track that stuff if it was being sold out the back door. There were 2 times during the war when it came out that there were some non-commissioned officers in the Ukrainian military that were trying to sell weapons on the black market. These were small arms, AK-47s, not American-built weapons, not American weapons at all. They were Russian or Soviet era weapons, but they were trying to sell them on the black market, and they were caught, they were arrested, and they were prosecuted for that 2 times. At the very beginning of the war, there was a lot of worry about saboteurs because the Russians had infiltrated into Kyiv and elsewhere and had dozens at least of Russian agents that were running around Kyiv starting fires uh, and trying to assassinate political figures, including the president of Ukraine. There was even one time where somebody was shot inside the presidential offices who had made it that far, got very close to President Zelensky and almost took him out. So there was a lot. They were very jumpy. Everybody was very jumpy. We had to be very careful because they had blocking positions and checkpoints all over the city. When you drive around, you come around a corner, there'd be a checkpoint there. If you're driving too fast, man, they'd jump out of there. They'd draw down on you. There were more than once when we actually got like a felony traffic stop, got taken out of the car, put on our faces on the ground, came up and patted us down for weapons and all that sort of thing. And people started saying, oh, Zelensky is closing down the churches. He's putting the stop to religious freedom in Ukraine. And I was, of course, reporting for the Christian Broadcasting Network for many years. I'm obviously interested in anything that has to do with religion. So I went to some of the churches in, both Kyiv and Odessa and Dnipro. Dnipro. What I found was a little more nuanced than that. Yes, Ukraine shut down some churches during the war, has shut down some churches. Let me tell you which churches they were. They were Russian Orthodox churches. So there are Ukrainian Orthodox churches and Russian Orthodox churches. There are Baptist churches. There are independent churches. There are all sorts of churches in Ukraine. I attended churches on Sundays whenever I could while I was there, and they continued to have services. There's a World Bread of Life church or something in Kyiv that I went to multiple times. They had their services and were packed with people. But the Russian Orthodox churches had a problem. And the problem was that the Russian government had replaced all of the Orthodox priests with KGB agents not KGB, the Russian intelligence service, which used to be the KGB. And those agents were caught sending messages back to Moscow, giving away the location of Ukrainian troops, the disposition of those troops, the position of air defense weapons, the position of tanks, et cetera, the movement of Ukrainian forces, the kind of intelligence that military might need to know. And they proved with beyond a shadow of a doubt that those messages were being transmitted out of Russian Orthodox churches around the country. And so they shut down the Russian Orthodox churches. They did not shut down all the churches, just the Russian Orthodox ones. And I think that's a pretty, understandable reason, right? We also heard a lot of talk about bioweapons labs that was coming from Russian propaganda, Russian state media, things like that. Bioweapons labs in Ukraine. And I looked up on the U.S. Embassy website. Sure enough, there were 15 there. They took them down eventually, but there were 15 locations that were listed on the website I believe it was 15, of labs that had been funded by the United States in Ukraine. And so I thought, what's going on here? Now, I have a friend who was a veterinary pathologist in the U.S. Army for many years. He's a colonel. And so I called him to ask him if he knew anything about him. He said, yeah, I worked in those labs. I can tell you all about them. So I did an interview with him about those labs, and he explained that they were defensive in nature. The idea was to improve existing laboratories across Ukraine and across the world, all over the planet, to improve existing labs, to make them capable of differentiating between naturally occurring toxic substances and weaponized toxic substances that would be a big problem for the United States and the world. It's an early warning system that they put together by funding these labs to improve their capabilities to ascertain whether or not anthrax, specifically, had been weaponized. And I went and visited one of the sites that was listed on the US Embassy website. Sure enough, it was a veterinary clinic in downtown Kyiv, surrounded by apartment buildings on all sides with very little security. Well, that's not a bioweapons lab, let me tell you. I've been to bioweapons labs. That's not what a bioweapons lab is. I went to two other sites that were coming out in Russian propaganda that saying that we bombed this site because it was a biolab, and it turned out they were heating centers. The way that they do heat in the city in Ukraine, it goes back to the Soviet Union, is they have a boiler plant in the middle of the neighborhood, each neighborhood, and then they pipe hot water out to each building through insulated pipes, and that hot water circulates through the radiators in every apartment and heats all the apartments. That's how everybody got their heat. And what Russia had actually blown up were the heating stations for the neighborhoods. And then Russia justified that by saying that they were bioweapons labs. They weren't. I went there myself. And they had, one of them had a playground right next to it, for example. You'd never put a playground next to a bioweapons lab. So it wasn't a bioweapons lab. Now, Russia, so I then eventually, after about 4 months, I left and then ended up going back multiple times over the last 2 years to update what's going on in Ukraine. I went on a trip in 2023 in June with the Free Burma Rangers. And that's where this shirt came from. We went on a humanitarian trip. As you might know, I'm a member of the Free Burma Rangers. We're a humanitarian aid organization that goes to war zones around the world and helps people in need. So we went there to bring help and hope out to the front lines. We visited the front lines around Kherson. We went on a mission with the International Legion one night. We interviewed people in Kramatorsk, which is kind of a central hub right near the front lines. And we were there when Kramatorsk was hit with a ballistic missile, very large missile. So it was, very little had changed other than the Ukrainians taking back Kherson. Matter of fact, my daughter Amy, who's Mrs. Tomlet now on the chat here, came over in November of 2022 and stayed with me we stayed for a couple months over there. She went down to Kherson with me 2 days after it was liberated from the Russians. And we took aid down there with another aid group. And we literally were there while Kherson was being shelled. Amy got to wear a flak vest for the first time. And we took aid out to the people, and we listened to their stories of the terrors that they endured under the Russian occupation while the Russians held Kherson. This is something that's very common. Whenever you talk to someone who was there under Russian rule, if the Russians took over an area, They will tell you the worst horror stories you've ever heard of atrocities that can't even be repeated. Not only against the civilians, but even against their own people, and certainly against Ukrainian soldiers. They said that in Kherson, they brought in crematorium trucks, these trucks with big crematorium, like burner things on them, and they would just throw the bodies of all the dead into these trucks and cremate them on the spot, both Ukrainians and Russians alike. So Russian soldiers that died, they would throw them in there. And that means that their families never really got any word about their Russian soldiers who died on the battlefield. That has been true up to this day. There are very detailed open source accountings of the number of dead, attempts by Western intel agencies and third-party NGOs to count the dead on both sides. Russia, the last time that they updated the number of dead soldiers was in 2022, and they said 6,000. So the official number of Russian soldiers who have died in this war to this day is 6,000 people. But that was a number they came out with in the middle of 2022. They've never updated it. The open source intelligence, the number of actual dead that is able to be counted through obituaries and photographs and bodies that were recovered by the Ukrainians and such like, things that are actually verifiable. The number of dead on the Russian side is 120,000, according to a study I saw yesterday. The true number is likely more than twice that. Well over 300,000 dead is likely the true figure on the Russian side. Now, the number of dead on the Ukrainian side, even including civilians, is not that high, and it's because of one thing. It's because the Russians really don't care about their own soldiers, and their tactics go back to the Soviet Union time when they would just do these meat wave assaults and just send their soldiers into the meat grinder and get them all killed. They still do that to this day. That's why more than half of the troops that are in the that were there at the beginning likely did not survive. Well, more than half. As far as now, the Ukrainians actually put out more verifiable numbers about their own dead, and they have likely lost somewhere around 75,000 troops. When you add in civilians, the total number is probably 150,000-ish, something like that. But the Ukrainians started out with the same tactics the Russians have. Just send your guys in there to get murdered. But now what they've learned over the interceding years, because they've had training and help from the West to do actual combined arms assaults, which means, working together with artillery and air support and everything to save the lives of your men, because your men are the most valuable resource you have. And so they've transitioned to a more NATO-centric fighting style, which puts the value of the human being first. And so that's why they've lost a lot fewer men than Russia has. Right now, the Ukrainians have more troops in the field than Russia does. The Ukrainians have about 1 million-man army. Russia has about 600,000 that are currently engaged in the fight. The Ukrainians have taken back more land than Russia has taken since this war began, meaning more land than Russia has taken and currently still holds. Russia, over the past year or so, has been making very slow, incremental gains on the battlefield, but they're making them so slowly and at such a cost that if nothing changes, it will cost them more than 60 million people to take the entirety of Ukraine, which obviously is not feasible. And it'll take them more than 60 years. I'm sorry, I said 60 million. 6 million people and 66 years is the rate that they're taking land in Ukraine right now. So obviously that's not sustainable even by the Russians, who have a very deep well of uh, foot soldiers that they can throw into the fight. That said, Ukraine is struggling. They're struggling because the Biden administration was giving them just enough to keep them going, but not enough to let them make any gains. The Biden administration put a lot of conditions on the aid that was given to Ukraine so that Russia could hide inside Russia. For example, hide their airplanes inside Russia, take off with airplanes loaded down with glide bombs, fly close enough to Ukraine to release those glide bombs and fly them into Ukraine without the planes themselves crossing into Ukrainian airspace. And Ukraine was not allowed by the Biden administration to bomb the airfields where those airplanes were refueling and rearming back in Russia. Russia has, throughout the war, threatened escalation, even threatened nuclear escalation many times. And that has never come to pass, obviously. Some people say it's doubtful whether or not Russia has very many functional nuclear weapons. Of course, nobody wants to find out, but they had over 1,900 of them at one time, but it's very costly and difficult to maintain those weapons. It's one of the reasons Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons. And so, listen, Russia is very unlikely to employ a nuclear weapon in Ukraine unless they get permission to do so, God forbid, by somebody like President Trump or something. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm just saying they're very unlikely to do that. Look, nuclear weapons only function as a deterrent. The reason why I'm calling this World War III is because, listen, how many countries are involved here? You have Russia, North Korea, China, Iran, Azerbaijan, maybe, that are involved on the Russian side. On the Ukrainian side, and Belarus, of course. On the Ukrainian side, you've got all of Western Europe, the United States. Colombia has sent troops to help fight in Ukraine. There are people from all over the globe. Pretty much everybody has taken sides on this fight, one way or another. So this is why I've said this is a world war. It's just that world wars are never going to look like they did in World War II because now everybody has nukes. So the nuclear armed powers cannot go to war with each other, because if you're into a conflict that you have to win, you must win. That losing means annihilation. Well, you may actually use the nukes, and everybody knows that. It bears pointing out that nobody was threatening to invade Russia before this started. There was no existential threat on Russia. Vladimir Putin has tried to make that case many times, and that is laughable on its face. Nobody wants Russia. Nobody. Even NATO was sort of kind of wasting away up until this time. By invading Ukraine, Russia created a self-fulfilling prophecy. He gave NATO a boost, made NATO relevant again, and made Ukraine want to join NATO, and a bunch of other people like Finland and Sweden. They all decided they wanted to join NATO too. They didn't do that until after Russia invaded. Russia created the conditions for the very things that Russia said that they were fighting to stop. By the way, the other Russian propaganda that was out was that was that Ukraine was full of Nazis, like actual Nazis, like Sieg Heil Nazis. I was, like I said, spent more than 6 months all over Ukraine, been all over, been out with the troops, been out with the Azov battalion, the brigades, all of the guys. I've yet to find anybody that I would consider to be a Nazi or even a white supremacist. I mean, they're all white. But I came to understand that when Russia says Nazi, what they mean is anybody who is against Russia and Russia's goals. That's the definition of a Nazi in Russia. So if Nazi, yeah, there's a lot of people in Ukraine who are against Russia's goal of taking over Ukraine. So by that definition, then yeah, everybody in Ukraine are Nazis and proud to be so, right? But not the kind of Nazis that we think of in the United States. Okay, so we just went over an hour. I wanted to, number one, first of all, ask you if you support the kind of news that I put out, please go and support us over at Locals rather than here on just on YouTube. I hope you'll subscribe on YouTube. I hope you'll like this video and share it with your friends. I hope you'll hit that notification bell to make sure that you get notified before we go live. But it'd be even better if you'd go over to Locals and just become a subscriber or supporter over there, because we will announce these lives over there and let you know ahead of time before I go live. So you get the same benefits, but it helps us not be as reliant on YouTube, which is a good thing, because who knows when YouTube will decide that something I said went against their policies and will just cut us off at the knees. That happens to far too many YouTube creators. So now I'm going to answer some questions for you now, and I'll try to make it quick and answer as many questions as I can, because I see there's been a lot of questions in the chat. So I don't know, Amy, if you can pin questions or not, but if you can, once I answer them, please take the pin off and pin another one for me. So we'll start with this first one that came through from Edward Sisson. Is it good or bad if Ukraine joins NATO? NATO is the most powerful military alliance ever seen in history. It represents more than 60% of all of the military might on planet Earth. NATO is not a threat to any country. NATO is a defensive alliance. It's not meant to, we're not going to band together Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, Sweden, and go and invade Russia. It's not going to happen. Never, 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 never. And it never has been a threat. It's always been a defensive alliance. And if we want to keep not just Russia, but other evil regimes at bay, then I think the bigger that alliance can get, the better. It's a mutual defense pact. Now, it's going to be a tough sell to get Ukraine into NATO. It's not as tough a sell to get Ukraine into the European Union. So we may get Ukraine back into the European Union. I mean, not back, but we may get them into the European Union. Today, Ursula von Leyen, who's a despicable person, said that they could probably get Ukraine into the EU before 2030. Of course, President Trump is offering Russia right out of the gate that NATO will never allow Ukraine to be a part of it. Ukraine's like, well, we need some security guarantees then by somebody. Can Russia join NATO? They could. It would be a long process. There's a process. You have to qualify to join NATO. It's a merit-based alliance. They just don't let anybody into that thing. So you have to meet certain criteria of press freedoms and religious freedoms and economic freedoms and all that kind of stuff. Russia doesn't qualify in any way, shape, or form right now. If Russia were to try to join NATO and were to become the free country that it would have to become to join NATO, then, whoops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to delete your question. I just meant to unpin it. If they were to do all those things, then NATO wouldn't need to exist anymore. Really, I mean, because they're the biggest threat to the European Union. Okay, so I guess we don't have a mod who has the ability to pin questions, so I'll just scroll back through here. Do you think that will give NATO to Ukraine if Zelensky steps down? Maybe. If you didn't see that yesterday, In response to President Trump calling Vladimir Zelensky a dictator, Vladimir Zelensky said, I will gladly step down and no longer be president right now. I will step down if it means an end to the war and or membership in NATO for my country. So what he did was he called President Trump's bluff. That is very bad behavior if he is actually a dictator, to offer to step down. And I truly believe he would, because again, I'm close to some people who sit next to him literally in his office, who have told me, and I've met him a couple times and interviewed him or whatever, but not, I don't know Zelensky that well, but just through the people who do, they tell me, look, he's a regular guy. He was the Trump figure in Ukraine. He was elected by the Ukrainians for the same reason that the Americans elected Donald Trump, as a big middle finger to the establishment that they saw as corrupt. They elected him with the mandate to get rid of the corruption, and he's actually done a lot to do that, to get rid of the corruption there. Harrison Broden says, I've seen Nazis on both sides of the war. Well, Harrison, how much time have you spent in Ukraine? I'm just curious. You've literally been there on the ground? You've seen it with your own eyes? Or you've seen videos that were put out? Because there's a big difference, buddy. How do China and North Korea fit into this? Well, Russia has gotten to the point where they are running out of poor, uneducated, third world Russians. You know, Russia is part third world country and part first world country. And they've been pinning this war on the back of the third world Russians since the beginning. So they go out into the villages and the countryside, and they forcibly they recruit those Russian men and send them off to the front, and they get killed, and it doesn't really matter. They have so far tried very hard to insulate the first world Russians who live in Moscow and St. Petersburg from the effects of the war, because they're the ones who really pay the taxes. And they've gotten to the point where that's really not possible anymore, that in order to bolster their numbers, they're having to recruit from the colleges and universities in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And so it's very costly. They have to offer very large bonuses and salaries to guys to get them to join voluntarily. So they found it to be much, much cheaper just to buy soldiers, literally buy soldiers from North Korea. And those soldiers come with very few strings attached. North Korea doesn't want them back, so they can get those guys killed all day long. China has not sent troops or much in the way of weaponry so far to Russia. They've tried to kind of stay above this, but believe me, they've been watching the war very closely, because the way the world responds to Russia's aggression against Ukraine is going to inform China's decision whether or not they will invade Taiwan. So if we want American troops directly engaged in war with China by 2027 or 2028, then we should continue on this path of sucking up to Russia and denigrating Ukraine that the Trump administration has begun, because that's what will happen. What the subtle message that President Trump doesn't realize he's sending to China right now is that it's okay if they go ahead and take Taiwan. But if that happens, there's a much bigger chance that the United States directly will get involved militarily against China in that war. And we may lose thousands of soldiers because we have treaties that obligate us to go to war directly if Japan, for example, or the Philippines is threatened and attacked. And that could very well happen. So we need to start thinking a little further ahead. That's how China and North Korea figure into this. Okay. let's see here. Didn't Ukraine get the Russian assets? Well, they're talking about it. What they've been doing is they've been using the interest on seized Russian assets as guarantees against loans that Ukraine is taking out if Ukraine can't pay them back. But now Europe is talking about outright confiscation of Russian assets that have been frozen, which amounts to about $300 billion across uh, across Europe, and just giving it to Ukraine. And you might say, well, why didn't they do that at the beginning? I mean, that sounds like a no-brainer. Well, it's not really a no-brainer because there's a lot of European and American assets tied up in Russia right now. And so Russia would do the same thing. They would just confiscate all the European and American assets and take those. So in a way, you would be taking money from American companies and European companies and transferring it to Ukraine by seizing those Russian assets. That's a tit for tat, right? So it's not that cut and dry. Let's see. See if I see any more questions here. Will this be the end of NATO? No, this will be the strengthening of NATO. This is going to result in a much stronger NATO, because now what's happening is this is maybe genius on the part of President Trump. President Trump, by signaling weakness toward NATO, NATO is going, oh crap! Now we're going to have to step it up. So all the countries of NATO are spending more on their militaries than they would have otherwise. This might be a ploy on the part of President Trump to get them to do that. He's been telling them for a long time that they need to step up their military spending to at least 4% of GDP. They were spending, many of those countries, 1 or 2%, if that. Spain was even less. So now you got Poland that's bumped it up to 6%. You got Germany and many countries over there that are bumping up their military spending. President Trump's claim that the United States has sent $350 billion or whatever it was to Ukraine is just outright fabrication. That's just not true. The real numbers are about $69 billion in military assets that have been transferred to Ukraine, and $120 billion or so in total, including humanitarian aid and cash assistance. Some of that, a good portion of that, $59 billion of it, has stayed in the United States and has gone to create jobs in the U.S. that with companies that make military hardware, both to replenish American stocks and to provide stuff to Ukraine. More than $10 billion of it has gone to keep American troops in the field in places like Hungary, Poland, the Netherlands, stuff like that, to pay for those U.S. troops being there. So it's not like all that money just was a check that got signed over to Ukraine and then it got lost. When President Zelensky said they don't know where 170 billion went, that's because they haven't received 170 billion. They've only received about 238 billion in total from everybody in the world, including the Europeans. In real numbers, in total numbers, including humanitarian aid, Europe has given Ukraine more than the United States has. That's another claim that Trump has made, is that the U.S. has far outspent Europe. It's not true. They haven't. The United States has given more in military aid to Ukraine, but has not given more in total aid to Ukraine. So I don't know exactly why President Trump feels the need to just outright lie about these things. I mean, exaggerating is one thing. He's exaggerating to an extent that it's hard to just write it off as just simple exaggeration. And he's doubling down on those exaggerations to the point where it's obvious that either he doesn't have anybody around him that has the guts to correct him because they'll get fired. That's a dangerous place for our country to be in. Or they know they're lying and they just are putting that misinformation out to try to rile up the American people. Both of those are very bad for America. I don't know which is worse. I'm not sure which I would prefer, to have a president that's clueless to the real numbers and none of his people are brave enough to give him the actual numbers, or to have a president and his cabinet who both know that they're using fake numbers and they're doing it willingly just to get the American people riled up against our ally, Ukraine. That, I don't know which is worse. That really bugs me. Don't understand why Trump flipped the script and is now blaming Ukrainians for starting the war. Yeah, I don't know either. I've made several lives about that. You can go back and watch them. We've talked at length about it. It could be that President Trump knows that Vladimir Putin is the kind of guy that has such an ego that making hard, harsh claims against Russia, telling Russia, this is what the way it's going to be or else, would only get President Putin to bow up against him. And the next thing you know, we're at nuclear conflict. And so he's flattering President Putin, but in reality will perhaps come down, when he actually comes down, will come down more in a more reasonable position on the side of Ukraine. Perhaps that's what he's doing. The whole world, like I said, maybe he's doing it just to force Europe to step up their game. Okay, Europe needs to step up its game. I think I'll end it here, and I'll end it with a question for you. I understand that America is out of money. I understand we have a lot of needs in the United States that need to be filled. I understand that Americans don't want to be involved in more endless wars overseas. We've had our fill of that. All that makes perfect sense. My question for you is, should America be involved in global affairs? Should America exercise soft power in terms of tariffs, economic sanctions, whatever, or hard power, military presence, or military strikes, actual kinetic warfare? Should we use any of those tools to try to affect events on the world stage to create positive outcomes for the American people? Or should America withdraw into itself and just let the world go to heck in a handbasket, let the chips fall where they may, let Russia, China, Iran, North Korea step into the vacuum that we just created by pulling out? And should we just give up our status as a world superpower? To put it more succinctly, do you believe America should be a global superpower or not? Yes or no? If you believe America should be a global superpower, we don't have the option of sitting out the first major land war in Europe since World War II. We just don't. We must be involved. Now, it sounds like we may be close to getting some sort of deal with Ukraine to get some of their mineral resources or natural gas resources or something like that. And that's a fantastic idea. Kudos to President Trump for coming up with some sort of quid pro quo so that we're not just doing this out of the goodness of our hearts. Because I believe that the American people should give out of the goodness of their hearts. The American government should give out of enlightened self-interest for the American people. Do you think America should be involved as a superpower on the global stage? If not, if you don't think that we should be involved in Ukraine at all, If you don't think that we should be I'm not talking about as we are now. I'm talking about in any way, shape, or form. If you don't think America should have anything to do with the war in Ukraine, if you don't think America should have anything to do with the war in Israel or the war in Armenia or the war in Burma or the war in Africa or the war in, Taiwan and China, if you don't think we should have anything to say about any of that, then what kind of America do you envision living in? Do you think that the world is going to leave us alone? Do you think that all of that mayhem and chaos and violence is going to stay outside our borders if we pull back into ourselves? Do you think that we can actually just ignore everything else in the world and have nothing to do with the rest of the world? And that everything will just be peachy keen for the United States? I think we might be unpleasantly surprised if that's the way we think. Okay? Juanita says at some point we're going to be too thinly spread and then we're not going to be able to protect ourselves. That is a real issue. One of the reasons why we probably shouldn't have reduced our Navy, for example, to less than 300 ships. But it might be possible to invest, I don't know, 5% of our military budget in any given year for the last 3 years to avert a situation where we have to commit 100% of our military budget to fight China by sending a message to China through the war in Ukraine. That might be worth some money up front. Pay me now or pay me later. It's the way it works usually. Everything must be done to protect the USA. Are the peace talks working? Well, we don't know yet. We'll see. Al Payne says it's not all or nothing. True. You're correct about that. It's not all or nothing. So where we come down in the middle is going to determine what kind of impact we have on the world around us. And I'll just tell you, to sum this up, from my experience covering the war in Ukraine on the ground, the Ukrainians themselves are an inspiration to me. They are fighting tooth and nail against a much larger adversary with some international support, but some international opprobrium. They are standing up and shedding their own blood to defend their country. And I wish I could say I believed that Americans would do the same in the same numbers that the Ukrainians have done. But I wonder. So I hope you'll go watch the little 10-minute documentary that we put together. Thanks to Nathan and Amy for editing that. That just shows some of the history that I have with Ukraine just throughout the war, some of the things that I've seen. And I'd like to end by just saying a prayer for peace this year, sooner rather than later in Ukraine. So if you're the praying sort, please join me, bow your heads, and we'll just pray. Lord God, I come to you right now and I ask that you would just send peace to Ukraine. Bring a sustainable peace. Bring a peace that doesn't come at the edge of a sword. Bring a peace that doesn't come with oppression. Bring freedom to the people of Russia who have themselves been oppressed by their own governments. Lord, thwart the plans of evil men. Send your angels to camp around those who fear you and rescue them. Uphold those who are righteous with your mighty right hand. Lord, give us clarity to see those who are hurting, to understand the pain, to have the empathy that you have, to see things from your point of view as we watch the news wherever it takes place. Let us always see things from your point of view, Lord, and get outside of our own political tribes, especially when it comes to loving the people around us and the people across the globe, our brothers and sisters who are hurting. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, folks, thank you very much for watching. I appreciate all of you. Again, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button. Go over to chuckholton.com and you can subscribe over there for free or become a supporter if you like. There's a lot of extra content that you aren't going to get on YouTube, and it's worth it. We're working hard to make it worth it. There's an amazing story over there I don't want you to miss about a Ukrainian soldier who was lost behind enemy lines for 9 months in Mariupol, hiding from the enemy, escaped capture, was almost executed twice. It's an amazing story. And thanks to Rubina for writing it. And we posted it up there over on Locals. Rubina did a great job with that. So thank you, Rubina. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Mama Marissa, and all of you who are faithfully watching every day as we've gone long today. So I appreciate all of you. We'll see you next time. Take care.